I think I want to live in Santa Barbara. It's lovely here. How do you all ever get any work done? That would be my challenge. It's just so very pretty here. So you can't argue with a 72-degree day at the start of February. And I think part of what I'm finding so special is the radical kinship that we experienced last night that we're focused on today. And what I'm going to focus on specifically is radical kinship in the midst of various generations and sometimes generational differences. Now, I'm curious, are there any millennials here? That means you were born between 1980 to 2000. That's the definition we're going to use. Millennials. Awesome. So millennials, you've gotten a bad rap in our culture. People can be pretty critical about millennials. In fact, there is a whole hashtag campaign called #HowToConfuseAMillennial, okay? So I'm going to post some of what people were posting about millennials in terms of how to confuse a millennial. Here's one. It's a little hard to see, but turn off their autocorrect. #HowToConfuseAMillennial. We heard stories last night from Father Boyle about how that can go bad, to be sure. But turn off their autocorrect. Here's another way to confuse a millennial, a young person. Show them a phone book. They do not know what to do with phone books. Even worse, show them a rotary phone. They have no idea what that is. Or here's one, how to confuse a millennial. Tell them, hey, look at this video cassette recorder. They have no idea what that is. Now, what happened with this hashtag, #HowToConfuseAMillennial, is that the millennials then got on board and they decided they were going to share some of their opinions about our culture today. So here's the millennial response. This is from actual young people, especially young adults. #HowToConfuseAMillennial, destroy the housing market, replace grad jobs with unpaid internships, tell them to buy a house. And the millennials are clapping about that. Yeah, you get it. Here's how else to confuse a millennial. Crash their economy and then condescendingly ask why so many of them are living with their parents. #HowToConfuseAMillennial. Tell them to follow their passions as long as they aren't passionate about art, writing, or anything creative. #HowToConfuseAMillennial. And then our last one, and I will confess I am guilty of this. Baby boomers will tweet, #HowToConfuseAMillennial, then call us to fix their internet problems 30 seconds later. If I'm ever having a technology problem, I just look for the youngest person around me and hand them my laptop, my tablet, my phone. Young people, we are thrilled that you are here today, whether you're millennials or even younger in the Gen Z. Yeah, absolutely. And a key leader at Fuller, our beloved senior trustee, Max Dupree, used to say, the first job of leaders is to define reality. So I'm going to define a little bit of reality of what it's like to be a young person today. The reality for young people. For young people today, 14 is the new 24. 14 is the new 24. Have you noticed with young people, there's like this gas pedal in their experiences? They are moving so quickly and they're experiencing what some of us over 30, they're experiencing it quite a bit younger than we did. I'm so glad June mentioned anxiety, and we're going to touch on this a number of times this morning. But 20% of teenagers say they worry a great deal about their present and future. 20% are that concerned. What's interesting, though, is when you compare the data about young people with the data of young people's parents and their perception, we have young people walking around who are stressed, but only 8% of parents are aware of this stress. So think about a young person who's near and dear to you, and I invite you, if you're over 30 today, to be thinking about a young person who's near and dear to you through the course of this presentation. If you're under 30 today, I invite you to think about somebody over 30 and what it would look like to have radical kinship with them. But for those of us over 30, the reality is that our young people are walking around even more stressed than we might realize. Not only that, 14 is the new 24, it's like this gas pedal, but then in some ways, young people are turning the corner into the traditional markers that have signaled adulthood 5 or more years later. They're getting married 5 years later. They're having babies 5 years later. This is census data. They are finishing school 5 years later. They're becoming financially independent 5 or more years later than some of us did. And I graduated from high school in the class of 1987. Anybody else with me? All right, a few of us, yes, 1987. It was a good year to graduate. And when I graduated, especially in kind of, middle class, upper middle class America, there was a pretty linear progression, which you can see on the screen. You go from high school to college, then maybe a job, then maybe marriage, then maybe kids. There's some deviation from this in the 80s and 90s, but it was a pretty straightforward path for most of us. For young people today, it's not so straightforward. The lines are all over the place. There's gap year, there's living together, there's internships, traveling abroad, living at home, having all sorts of roommates. So young people are in this crazy dichotomy when in some ways they're moving forward so quickly, 14 is the new 24, but then some of what it means to be an adult is happening later. So while 14 is the new 24, 28 is the new 18. 28 is the new 18, which leaves young people a little confused, and it leaves those of us over 30 probably just as much, maybe even more confused. And so thanks to a grant from the Lilly Endowment, as well as a host of other foundations, we at the Fuller Youth Institute, we were able to study young people, and specifically churches that were doing amazing work with young people. The typical church in the US is aging and or shrinking. And we thought, you know what? We want to study those who are beating those odds. We want to study those churches who aren't aging or shrinking, but are growing young. They aren't aging or shrinking, but they are doing excellent ministry with young people. And what's fascinating is while we started our research, because we wanted to see how churches change young people, along the way, we found, yes, that is happening, but what is equally true is young people are changing churches. Can anyone say amen about that? And so I want to think with you in the whole spirit of radical kinship and thinking about what's happening with those under 30 as well as those of us over 30 about 3 radical kinship shifts. 3 shifts we need to make if we're going to have radical kinship that crosses the age gaps that we experience. What do we need to do differently based on our research with young people, adults, parents, mentors, grandparents, leaders like you, as well as over 250 churches that are growing young? What do we need to do differently to be in relationship with this generation? Here's the first shift. We need a whole lot less judgment and a whole more journeying with. A whole lot less judgment and a whole lot more journeying with. The labels that are given to young people today, no wonder young people don't want to engage in certain cultural institutions when everything they hear about themselves is negative. I had the news on this morning and a Snickers ad was saying negative things about a 20-something. Negative messages are rampant in our culture about young people, and it's not fair to young people. There's a phrase that I'm so glad Steve Argue is here. He and I talk a lot about this. We've co-authored books together. He's doing a seminar this morning for those of you who are on the youngish side. We'll let you determine maybe what that is, but for those who are on the youngish side, I encourage you to go to it. But he has said something so powerful that there's a 5-word phrase that we need to avoid in our relationships with young people. And it's this: when I was your age. When I was your age. Because things have changed. Things have changed, and that puts us in a posture of lecturing. I so love what Father Boyle said, that the lines between those who are providing services and receiving services, they get blurry. And I would say when it comes to the best radical kinship relationships across generation, the lines get a little blurry. Here's a little meme. When I was your age, we fought with fists, not with caps lock. Some of us can relate to that. How many of you are parents or grandparents of a young person? Okay, the vast majority of you. Again, Steve Argue and I, we did a lot of reflection over the last couple years of what it means to journey with young people, not just as churches, but as parents and grandparents. And we've developed a whole new posture for parenting and grandparenting. So many of us, we're afraid that as our kids grow up, and I get this, my kids are 19, 17, and 13. I get this. We're afraid that as our kids or our grandkids grow up, we're going to grow apart. And what we want to say at the Full Youth Institute is you don't have to grow apart. You can actually grow with each other. So here's our definition of growing with parenting. A mutual journey of intentional growth for both parents and our children that trust God to transform us all. A mutual journey of intentional growth for parents and our children that trust God to transform us all. I'm going to be showing some slides that build into a particular diagram, and I can see a number of you are taking notes, as I did last night. That's awesome. Keep taking notes. At the end of this morning, especially since it's a little hard to see, at the end of this morning, I'm going to give you a number that you can text, and you can get a bunch of free resources from us, including many of the diagrams that I'm going to show. So, and if you're a little bit confused by that, just hand your phone to the nearest young person. They'll be able to figure it out for you. So 13 to 18-year-olds, what Steve and I wanted to do is figure out how do we best parent 13 to 29-year-olds or grandparents. And we've tended to think of that age range in two big buckets, teenagers and young adults. Well, given some of what we've already looked at briefly today, that's not really nuanced enough for today's young people. And so we divided teenagers and young adults into three buckets. And for those of you who are 13 to 29, man, I would love your thoughts about this on a break or come find me at lunch. And what's fascinating is as we're sharing this, not just with parents and grandparents, but those under 30, it's causing those under 30 to think about how do I want to change my relationship with the adults who are closest to me. So regardless of your age, you can think about how we're building radical kinship. Here's the first age bucket. Age 13 to 18. Age 13 to 18, and we call those folks learners. They're learners. They're growing physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. It's a time of rapid growth or learning. Right around age 18, and these age divisions are very fluid. Your results may vary. So think about the young person that you have in your mind. It might be a little different for them, but typically right around age 18, about high school-ish graduation, that learner transitions into being an explorer. This is from age 19 through 23. 18 through 23. We on purpose had overlap. 18 through 23. An explorer is often leaving home or home-oriented routines for the first time. Could be college, could be military, could be workforce. They're excited about the possibilities that are in front of them, but they're also kind of nervous. That's the explorer, age 18 through 23. Then right around age 23, that explorer transitions into a focuser. A focuser from age 23 to 29. Now, this young person has made particular choices about career, about vocation, about relationship, about faith that have opened a lot of doors, but it's also, those choices have also closed a lot of doors. And focusers, a lot of them feel good about their decisions, a lot of them have some regret, and a lot of focusers actually feel like they're behind, especially when well-intentioned adults put a lot of pressure on them. So what we want to do is recast teenagers and young adults into more nuanced and actually more accurate categories for today's young people as learners, explorers, focusers. Now, if that's our young people, what does that mean for those of us who are over 30? What kind of parenting, grandparenting, maybe even mentoring does it take to have radical kinship with these types of young people? Well, a learner, what they most need from us is they need us to be a teacher. They need us to be a teacher. If you're parenting, grandparenting, mentoring a high school student, you know that you're doing a lot of teaching. And I want to suggest there's three areas in particular where you want to focus. By the time this young person reaches approximately 18, you want to make sure that you've taught them when it comes to self-reflection, self-discipline, and collaboration. So that's that teacher role, okay? Now, right about, again, when your young person's about age 18, you as a parent or grandparent transition from being a teacher to a guide. From a teacher to being a guide. Now, just like a good guide on a trail or in a neighborhood figures out when do they need to step in and help more and when can they back off a little bit, the art and science of parenting this age is figuring out when do you need to step in And when can you let them go on their own? I am a mom of a 19 and 17-year-old who are both really transitioning from learners to being explorers. And I'm having some success, but also some struggles in transitioning from being a teacher to being a guide. I'm falling prey to my brother, the same thing my brother and I have said about our mom over the last decades. I am now doing the same thing. I am being overly helpful with my young people. So my college freshman, I used to order things for him on Amazon when he was at home. Now when I offer to order him something on Amazon, he I can tell forcefully but kindly on text says, "No, Mom, that's okay, I got it covered." He's transitioning from being a learner to explorer, and so I need to back off. Now, we've drawn some dots in this diagram also. The solid dot is the young person. The emptied out dot is the person over 30. You can make of that what you will in terms of how you interpret that. But the teacher is a little bit ahead of the learner. The guide and the explorer, it's far more mutual. And then right around at age 23, when the explorer is becoming a focuser, the guide becomes a resourcer. The guide becomes a resourcer. And what we've heard from parents and grandparents interviewed around the country is they feel like they're kind of a library card catalog waiting for their young person to ask them questions. Some of you are too young to know what a card catalog is, but it's kind of like Google, okay, where you can go and ask questions in the library. And as you see in this diagram, the young person dot is actually a little bit ahead of the parent, grandparent, mentor dot, because we're trying to respond, as those of us over 30, to the questions of young people. What we've constantly heard from parents and grandparents is it was so much better. It was so much better when the young person asked them a question, asked them for resources, for advice, than them stepping in. So if we're going to have radical kinship, we need to journey with, not judge. In the midst of our growing young research, we also wanted to see what does it look like to be a leader who journeys with young people. And when we started, and we're going to study these churches that are doing great work with young people, people would come to me and say, well, Kara, isn't just, especially when it comes to leadership, isn't it about leaders being hip and cool? Now, nice response. Now, my own teenage children would say, just the way that I said hip and cool betrays that I am neither hip nor cool, okay? Now, if you are a leader with young people or someone mentoring young people, building radical kinship, and you're hip and cool, that's awesome. Keep being your hip and cool self. But for the rest of us, I have good news. In the course of our research, this is what one senior pastor told us. There's a new definition of cool. For young people today, warm is the new cool. Warm is the new cool. We don't have to be totally hip, but what young people are looking for is warm, authentic relationships. One of the questions we looked at our research also when it came to growing young churches is what about sermons? How important are sermons in engaging young people? Now, let me be clear, they were important. But they were actually less important in engaging young people than building relationships with young people. Here's what one leader told us during the course of our research. You can download good preaching, but you can't download thoughtful mentoring. You can download sermons, perhaps even amazing sermons online, but what a young person can't download, what the church, what radical kinship can offer, is thoughtful mentoring. Now, in the midst of our research, Dave and I, my husband and I, we've thought a lot about what does this really look like in our family. And we've been helped by my friend, Chap Clark, who has said a lot of amazing things about young people over the decades. But he said something maybe 5-6 years ago that was game-changing for our family, and maybe it'll be so for yours. He said, we need a new 5-to-1 ratio. What did he mean by that? Well, if I was speaking to the leaders at your church, your faith community, we might talk about their ratio of adults to kids. They want 1 adult for every 5 kids. Say for Sunday school tomorrow. Say for a retreat coming up. 1 adult for every 5 kids. Well, what we're saying out of our research and what Chap has said so well is it's not about one adult for every 5 kids. It's 5 adults for each kid. It's a reversed ratio. It's 5 adults who, as we say to our kids, as we talk about it, our family, 5 adults who are on your team. 5 adults who are praying for you. 5 adults who are showing up at your soccer games. 5 adults who are coming to your play. 5 adults who are that safety net for you when there are things for some reason you can't talk about with your parents. Who are those adults that you can talk to about it? In fact, as our kids were little, we would play the game, and even into teenage life, who would you talk to about? Who would you talk to about? If there was something going on in your life and you couldn't talk to me or Dave, who would you talk to about vaping, about cheating, about anything you were experiencing? Who would you talk to about it? I mentioned I have a 19-year-old, Dave and I do. He's a college freshman in Houston. And when he turned 18 in his senior year, we wanted to give him something that stood for all the adults who are on the team and something that he could take with him to Houston. I'm tall. I'm 6 feet tall. Our 3 kids are all tall. I think our smallest kid is now 5'10", so we have some tall teenagers in our house. They're athletic and tall, but they're not very aggressive out on the field or out on the court. They don't really like touching the other team. So volleyball has been a perfect sport for the Powell children. They're tall, athletic, and you get in trouble in volleyball when you touch the other team. So this works great for them. So before Nathan turned 18, and we'll do the same thing with our girls, we got a white volleyball, and we drove it all around Los Angeles and had adults who were significant in Nathan's life sign that volleyball. We kept it a secret from him, we hid it from him, and then on his 18th birthday, we presented him with that as well as a $6 stand I got from Amazon. And every time I go and visit Nathan in his dorm room, on the windowsill is that volleyball. A constant reminder of the adults who have built radical kinship with him, of the adults who aren't there to judge him, but are there to journey with him. So the first shift that we need to make is to be empathetic with young people instead of condemning. Here's the second shift we need to make. If we're going to have radical kinship that crosses the age gaps, we need less denial and more openness to doubt. Less denial and more openness to doubt. I love middle schoolers. I love all young people, but there's something about middle schoolers and their questions and their changing and their awkwardness that just is endearing to me. And there was a middle school boy who represented what so many middle schoolers have in terms of they have deep questions about God. And this middle school boy, 13-year-old boy, his name was Steve, and he went to his senior pastor at his church. He had a lot of questions about life and God, so he asked the senior pastor, "Pastor, if I raise my pinky finger, does God know what finger I'm going to raise before I raise it?" And the pastor said, "Yes, Steve, God knows what finger you're going to raise before you raise it." Steve was really bothered by starving children around the world, but especially in Africa. So he pulled out from behind his back a copy of a Time magazine that had starving children in Africa on the cover. And he said, "Well then, Pastor, does God know what's happening with these starving children in Africa?" Big question for a junior high boy to ask. And the pastor said, "Yes, Steve, God knows what's happening with those children in Africa, and we just need to trust God." That answer wasn't very satisfying to Steve. He was disillusioned by the church and the church's inability to really talk deeply about tough questions. So Steve walked out of that Lutheran church that morning and never went back to a Christian church for worship. Now, the Steve that I'm talking about is actually one that I'm guessing all of you have heard of, because it's Steve Jobs. In the Isaacson biography, this story about Steve is told. It's like 500 pages. I read the biography when I switched from PC to Mac. It is better. I'm just saying. It is better. Amen. Yeah, we don't amen to Jesus, but we amen to other things. So, yeah, absolutely. So Steve, middle school Steve, came to his pastor with a tough question. He hit the ball over the net to the pastor, and the pastor didn't know how to hit it back. It could have been an on-ramp to real conversation, but instead, for Steve, it was a dead end. Now, Steve has had amazing influence in our world when it comes to technology, but just imagine if Steve's kingdom, if his entrepreneurial energy had been turned into kingdom purposes. I think our world would be different, not just because of technology, but in other ways. And here's what I want you to know. There are Steves in your church also. There are Steves in your family room, in your home also. Young people who have big questions about God. And they're wondering, where's the safe place? A place that won't be a place of denial, but a place that will be open to my tough questions. In fact, according to our research, 70% of young people, let me be more clear, 70% of youth group graduates admit to having doubts. And those are just the ones that admit to it. If anything, that percentage is higher. So as you think about the young people in your community, in your church, in your family, at least 7 of 10 of them have significant questions about God. Now, sometimes that can cause us to freak out, like, oh my goodness, what do we do with young people's doubts? That's terrible. Here's one of the bigger surprises of our research, is that when young people had the opportunity to express and explore those doubts, that was actually correlated with greater faith maturity, both in high school and in college. Let me put it far more simply. Doubt isn't toxic to faith, silence is. Doubt isn't toxic to faith, it's silence that is toxic to faith. And so the question for those of us who are over 30 who want to experience radical kinship is, how do we have the best conversation we can with a young person about doubt? In our Growing With book, Steve and I give a couple questions. You might want to jot these down. I find these enormously helpful with my own teenagers. And it's this. What do you no longer believe that you think I still believe? What do you now no longer believe that you think I still believe? And then in some ways the inverse. What do you now believe that you think I don't believe? What do you no longer believe that you think I still do believe? And what do you now believe that you think I don't believe? I ask my kids those questions, and I just wait. And sometimes they say, well, actually, not much has changed. And sometimes, especially one of them, has a pretty decent list of ways their faith is evolving. I'm kind of trying to get my head around this. You see, we want faith to grow, and we want our young people's faith to grow, but we don't want their faith to change. That doesn't feel like it works right? Something's amiss there. We, those of us over 30, need to be comfortable with the way that young people's faith is both growing and changing. And the way that they have new questions that maybe we haven't thought of, the way that they're asking new questions of God and life. And I know some adults are afraid, some of us over 30 are afraid to raise this to have space for this kind of ambiguity, because we think, what if that young person stumps us? I have news for you. I've been through 26 grades of school, and my 13-year-old can stump me with her tough questions. So it's actually not what if our young people stump us, but what do we do when they stump us? So our favorite recommendation at the Full Youth Institute to offer to parents, grandparents, leaders, volunteers, mentors is to keep this phrase in your back pocket. It's this: I don't know, but. I don't know, but. 4 words. I don't know, but. You see what I wish that senior pastor had told Steve is, Steve, that is such a good question. I don't know. But how about you, me, and your mom get together and talk about it with this woman who really loves science? Or I wish that pastor had said to Steve, Steve, great question. I don't fully know, but how about if you and I, let's get together and look at scripture together and continue the conversation. I don't know, but was an important phrase in our family when we went through the biggest upheaval our kids have ever experienced or seen in another family. I had a close friend, Chrissy, who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She was about my age, had 4 kids. She did an aggressive chemotherapy. She flew every week to Phoenix for this aggressive, somewhat experimental chemotherapy. On May 8th, after she had been in this chemo for months, it was my daughter's birthday. We were at a pizza place. I knew Chrissy was going to get blood results back that day. And so I walked out of the pizza place, stood on the sidewalk, and I called her and said, Chrissy, what did the blood say? She said, Kara, I'm cancer-free. The doctors don't know what to do about this. I'm cancer-free. God has healed me. That was May 8th. It was the biggest answer to prayer our kids had ever personally seen. Because as a family, we had been praying for Chrissy. Cancer-free, defying medical expectations. That was May 8th. On November 3rd, her family was in our living room, and Chrissy had a seizure. Paramedics came, took her to the hospital, and the cancer was back, and her brain and her spine were riddled with tumors. It was too late to do anything about it. It had attacked her so aggressively within just a few months. And so we had to tell our kids, after the May 8th healing, the November 3rd bad news. It wasn't too many weeks after that Chrissy actually passed away. We had to tell our kids, Chrissy, the mom of your friends, this woman we've been praying for, the woman who we saw healed 7 months ago, she's gone to be with Jesus. And our middle child, she's a strong one. She's the kind that teachers her whole life, parent-teacher conference, have said she's really verbal, one of those kinds of kids. She ran out of the living room where the 5 of us were talking and went to her room. Dave stayed with our other 2. I followed after Krista. And she was stomping in a circle, the small the patch of carpet that remained after her bed and her desk. She was stomping in a circle. She said, Mom, why would God take Chrissy, especially after he healed her? Why would God heal Chrissy and then take her? I mean, a person wouldn't even do that, so why would God? I've been to 26 grades of school. I have a master's of divinity and a PhD in practical theology. I didn't know how to answer her question. So I sat on her bed as she continued to stomp. And I eventually got to the place of saying, Krista, I don't know. But here's what I have seen to be true about God. And here's this verse in the Bible, Romans 5:3-4, that suffering leads to perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. When, not if, when a young person comes to you with a tough question, I don't know, but is a great way to have a conversation and also buy you a little bit of time to do some research, reflection on your own or with them. In our last 10 minutes, we're going to talk about this third shift when it comes to radical kinship across the generations. Less silence about anxiety and more empowering empathy. I had one of your youth leaders ask me last night about anxiety. Anxiety is rampant in our culture these days. It's interesting, 5 years ago at the Full Youth Institute, the most common type of question that came our way from leaders and parents was about technology. How do I navigate technology at home or in our ministry? And now, by far, the biggest questions are about anxiety, depression, even suicide. 1/3 of the US population, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, 1/3 of the US population, young and old, is affected by an anxiety disorder over their lifetime. That means 1/3 of us are going to deal with a diagnosable anxiety disorder in our lifetime. 1/3 of the people we care about are going to deal with a diagnosable anxiety disorder. And when it comes to those under 30, even those who don't have diagnosable anxiety are certainly anxious. I can't remember the last time I've talked to a teenager who wasn't anxious. I can't say all because I'm a researcher, so I have to qualify it. But pretty much almost all young people are dealing with stress and a level of anxiousness that's different than what some of us dealt with. We're hearing about it, rural Iowa, inner city New York, beautiful Santa Barbara. It doesn't matter. It's across the country, across ethnicities, across socioeconomic statuses, across education levels. I was speaking in Chicago a few months ago, and a mom came up to me. She was both a mom and a grandparent. And she said something I'd actually never heard before. She said, I married a man who had 3 children, three girls. One of them committed suicide. And then a few years later, a second of the daughters committed suicide. I've cried with parents and grandparents who've been affected by one, but I've never met somebody who's had 2 kids commit suicide. I was speechless. I was totally speechless. I'm not a therapist. I'm sure there are amazing therapists in the Santa Barbara community. But I've spent enough time with therapists, and we at the Full Youth Institute wanted to offer parents and grandparents and leaders like you the tools you needed. June's already mentioned our podcast, our curriculum. Just this last month, as I was looking over everything we've heard from therapists, I realized, wow, it's really 5 things. And they kind of spell out A, B, C, D, E. So you are only the second group that I've shared this with. One other group in Atlanta this week, and now you. But when I think about what we need to do as caring adults, building radical kinships with anxious young people, it spells out A, B, C, D, E. Here's the A. We learned this from a great therapist who specializes in adolescent anxiety. Ask them, can you rate your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst? Can you rate your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst? If it's 1 to 3, it's no big deal. If it's 4 or 5, it's probably handleable. At about 6 is when it's more serious, and we need to think about how we want to intervene. So first, get a gauge. Ask them, how would you rate your anxiety? And again, at about 6 is when we want to think about more serious intervention. We learned this from another therapist, the power of breathing deeply. The power of breathing deeply. You know how when you get kind of a rush of adrenaline, your heart starts pounding? Your heart's trying to send blood to all parts of your body. If we can discipline ourselves to breathe deeply and our lungs slow down, that automatically triggers our whole body and our heart slows down. So it's like the body's, it's like God's brake pedal that God's given us to calm us down, breathing deeply. Breathing deeply. I've heard all my life, breathe deeply. It's only been in this last 6 months as we've done this research that I understand why. Center on a helpful truth or phrase. Center on a helpful truth or phrase. What is it that you can agree on with a young person, that a young person can reflect on? Our 8th grader, our youngest, she's taking high school entrance exam today. It's kind of a stressful experience for her. And so I texted her this morning and I said, hey babe, you've worked so hard for this. I told her our family-centered phrase. This is the phrase that our whole kid's life we've helped them anchor to. And it's Emmanuel, God is with us. So I just said, hey babe, you've worked so hard on this. Emmanuel, I'm praying for you. What is that phrase? What is that phrase that young person can go back to? D, develop your team. Develop your team. If you're talking to a young person and they're anxious about soccer, help them think about who's someone on the soccer team or a coach I can talk to if I'm feeling anxiety. If you're not their parent, encourage the young person to talk to their parent about it. That parent should be on the team. And I can't recommend enough the importance and the power of therapy with trained professionals, with trained mental health professionals. That person might need to be on your team. Because see, the brain's an organ. The brain's an organ, and just like we sometimes need to see a doctor and even sometimes get medicine for our heart and our liver, same thing's true with our brain sometimes. So a therapist, a doctor might be part of that team. And then lastly, empower through empathy. Empower through empathy. One word without the other, one of these E's without the other is lacking. See, we want to empower young people, but we also want to empathize or feel with young people. Lisa D'Amour is an author who's specialized in adolescent girls. Her latest book deals with anxiety in adolescent girls, but honestly, her principles are true for boys too. She has this great phrase. I've been using it in parenting ever since I read it, not just in moments where one of my kids is anxious, but just across the board, it's this: that stinks, and I think you can handle it. That's hard. Boy, you're right. That's really tough. I think you can handle it. Do you need any help from me in handling it? What can you do to handle it? What can we do to handle it together? But you're starting with empathy. You're starting with empathy, but then you're empowering them. You're giving them agency and a sense of momentum to move forward. I said that I was going to give you a number that you could text to. So it's like a phone number. If you enter the number 66866, like that's who you're texting, and put the word tools in the subject of the email, of the text, and again, I know enough to help you with this, or ask somebody else to. And this is how you'll get a whole bunch of free resources that go deeper into growing with parenting and growing young churches and how to deal with anxiety. The number is 66866, and you all know the Bible well. That's dangerously close to 3 6s in a row. But don't worry, we've got an 8 in the middle, so you're really clear. It's all good. One last thought on young people today and radical kinship. The city of Palo Alto, where Stanford is located in the Bay Area, has had a real surge in teen suicides. The Atlantic ran a cover story on suicides just in Palo Alto and Menlo Park a few years ago. And the way that young people are taking their own life in the city of Palo Alto, primarily, or at least certainly frequently, has been stepping in front of the train that runs through the city. And so the city of Palo Alto decided that they were going to have a security guard watch the train tracks at the places where young people were most likely to step in front of the tracks. They were going to pay a security guard to watch the train tracks to try to prevent young people from doing that. I'm glad the city's done that. I really am. But let me say this, Santa Barbara friends, the church needs to be out on the tracks also. The church needs to be on the tracks, helping young people in crisis, the kind of people we heard about from Father Boyle last night, as well as the young people in our own midst. And not only that, not only does the church need to be on the tracks helping young people, the church needs to be like a quarter mile ahead of the tracks, helping young people, and a quarter mile ahead of that, and a quarter mile ahead of that. Radical kinship starts with relationship, with journeying with being open to young people's doubts, and with being a safe place for them to talk about their anxiousness and stress. Let me pray for us. God, I thank you, first of all, for those under 30 who are in the room. Thank you for their passion, their wisdom, their insights, their vitality. I pray that you would show them what it means to live in radical kinship with the marginalized, like we talked last night, as well as with those of us over 30. And I pray for those of us over 30 that you'd show us what we need to do, who we need to be to really love and empower and learn from this generation of young people. Thank you for what you're doing in Santa Barbara. Thank you that, as was said earlier, there's not a lot of churches in Santa Barbara. There's really one church in Santa Barbara. And give us a taste of that today that leaves us hungry and wanting more as we leave. In your name, Jesus, amen.